Welcome to Hot Chips 30. Session 4. Security.
So I'm Alan Smith. I'll be your session chair for this session. And this session is entitled Security. Probably we should have done this in conjunction with the most recent keynote. And our first speaker is going to be Doug Stiles of Microsoft, whose presentation title is The Hardware Security Platform Behind Azure Sphere. Doug is a Senior Director of Hardware Engineering in the Silicon Development Group at Microsoft. He's been at Microsoft for 20 years. Prior to working at Microsoft, he was at the 3DO Company, Kubota Pacific Computer, and Rome Milspec Computers. He has a bachelor's from San Jose State University. Doug?
So I'm going to talk about the hardware security platform behind Azure Sphere. I'm certain that there's a significant number of you that have never heard of Azure Sphere, so I'm going to provide a little bit of background to start. Before I actually talk about Azure Sphere, I want to talk just a little bit about what led to it and some of the background of how we ended up in developing the program. It's about microcontrollers, or microcontroller units, or MCUs. The MCUs are essentially low-cost single-chip computers. The one that's shown here, the TMS 1100, introduced by TI in the early 70s, was the first device that had a processor, read-only memory, and rewrite memory on the same die. They're used all over the place. They don't require the massive processing that many of these chips you've been hearing about today. Most of them are, as a matter of fact, in 2017, the majority of them were not even 32-bit devices. So they can be manufactured in low-cost, older, fully depreciated fabs. But what has happened that's been interesting in the last several years is that those older, depreciated fabs now allow for some pretty sophisticated processors, some pretty good overall performance, a wide variety of connectivity solutions, as well as sizable on-chip memory. As I mentioned, MCUs are used all over the place. In 2017, there were about 9 billion connected devices shipped, and it's estimated that there will be 30 billion of them just a year and a half from now. That's a big attack surface. Those of you that heard the presentation at the keynote, that's a lot of devices that can be leveraged in nefarious ways. About 2 years ago, almost exactly 2 years ago, internet security researchers discovered the Mirai Virus. This is a virus that was basically propagated across Linux systems and allowed the hackers to use those as a large internet botnet to attack DIN, a DNS service provider. And with that attack, they were able to use 100,000 infected devices to pretty much cripple most internet services in the significant portions of North America and Europe for the better part of a full day. But that's not the worst thing that could possibly happen. Hackers could use these for means that actually jeopardize human safety. You know, consider somebody takes control of your internet-connected oven that you think is so convenient because you can make sure that it's turned off when you take off on vacation and you just weren't certain. They'd turn on the gas and leave it on all day, for example. Or, you know, take control of a stoplight in an intersection and turn all the lights green at the same time. So this is what led us to develop Azure Sphere. Azure Sphere is an end-to-end solution for securing MCUs, or MCU-powered devices. It starts with an Azure Sphere class of MCU. For us, we've defined a new MCU, which I'm going to present the first one that's been developed today, talk about some of its features. On top of that MCU is an operating system that Microsoft has leveraged its many years of experience in battling internet security issues to secure that operating system. And additionally, there's an Azure security service, which gives us a means of securely connecting to the cloud and communicating data in a secure fashion, but authenticating the devices that are running it. And it provides a method of delivering software updates as time goes on. The security researchers that started this program sat down and said, well, as engineers, people are going to need methods of measuring whether or not they're living up to the standards of what security is. So they tried to define these 7 properties of secure MCUs, or secured devices, secured connected devices, I should say. The first of these is a hardware root of trust. The hardware itself has to participate in the security. Software is never sufficient. And each device has to have a unique ID. It's another important feature of it. There's got to be defense in depth. No one security feature is ever sufficient. Hackers are going to find cracks. In the keynote, you found out they found a crack that existed for 20 years. Right? When these are identified, you have to make sure that that one feature doesn't reveal all of the secrets of the device. It's also important to have a small trusted computing base. Your security code needs to be very specifically isolated. It needs to be small and contained, something that can be very analyzed in detail, and it doesn't have a large attack surface, a lot of code where you could possibly make mistakes. Dynamic compartments. You need methods of updating these things individually, individual pieces of code, and you also need means of managing that code space when it's operating on the machine so that it's isolated from areas that it doesn't belong. Certificate-based authentication. Azure Sphere MCUs don't use passwords. People are horrible about not changing the root password on their home network equipment. There's just all kinds of reasons that you don't want to rely on passwords. So we generate device-specific certificates for these so that they can be authenticated by the cloud service. And I'll talk a little bit more of that a little bit further on. They need means of failure reporting. We intend these devices to be out in the field for a decade or more. In order for that software to remain secure and stay that way for a long period of time, it's a race that you're playing against hackers. You must have hardware that detects things that are anomalies, anything that goes wrong, anything that happens in a behavior that you don't expect needs to be reported back to the cloud service where it can be analyzed and detected as early as possible. I think one of the things mentioned in the keynote was that people are usually in your system for 100 days on average before you know it. We need to find these things as quickly as possible, get software fixes out there that patch these things as quickly as we possibly can. And you also need renewable security. You need to be able to deliver hot software updates. You need to be able to do that in a secure fashion. And you need to be guaranteed that older versions of the software where security breaches exist can no longer run. So Azure Sphere MCUs are connected, they're secured, and they're crossover devices. I want to talk about crossover just for a second. In this case, most of the MCUs that exist today are very simple processors, very scalar, like I said, very low cost. One of the things that we wanted to exist here was a processor that had an MMU, basically so that we could run a pretty full-featured OS. We need to be able to create page tables to do that. You need to be able to isolate processes. This is the first Azure Sphere MCU. It was a co-development between Microsoft and MediaTek. As you can see, it's not an exciting technology. It's a 40 nanometer RFCMOS. It's very mature. It's been around for a long time. This device is not large. It's about 35 square millimeters. 368 million transistors, of which over 300 million are SRAM. But it's low cost. It's a system and package design. There are 2 flash die incorporated inside the package to kind of help reduce system cost and provide the long-term storage in your code storage space. It's in a dual row, quad flat, no lead package, a low cost plastic package. It's only 12 millimeters on a side. And in order to help reduce the system cost further, it uses a single 3.3 volt supply. And the internal voltages required for the analog circuitry, core voltage, and the fuse programming voltages are all generated by an on-chip power supply unit. Just quickly, there's system memory. You can see these large regular structures, the caches for the A7, the Wi-Fi radio, and its baseband processing, I/O processing, and the PSU down in the corner. The rest of it's pretty much a CA of gates, single, I mean, it can be pretty much placed en route as a single block, didn't require tiling. Here's a block diagram of the chip. As you can see, there's 5 main processing systems on it. It's got an application processor for running the OS and the high-level app. The Pluton security core, which is kind of where I'm getting to eventually. There's the group of I/O peripherals and their respective I/O processors, where they're coupled with a set of dual I/O processors, as well as the Wi-Fi subsystem. I'll talk about each one of these. The Wi-Fi subsystem uses a dedicated N9 processor. It's a 32-bit RISC core. It'll operate up to 160 megahertz, so not terribly high performance, but adequate for 802.11a, b, g, and n. It's dual band, so we have connectivity solutions that work pretty much worldwide in the Wi-Fi space. Does have built-in receiver diversity support, so that when it's used with a dual antenna system, you can actually do a little of the beamforming response in order to improve the connectivity to your base station. The I/O peripherals, we wanted to make a fairly generic chip that could be used in a wide variety of applications. We weren't targeting any specific application when we were working on this, so we wanted some pretty general purpose interface connections. So it's got a lot of standard GPIOs. It does have 2 I2S interfaces for audio applications. There's a collection of 5 ISUs. These are just groups of 6 pins that can be configured either as I2C, SPI, or a UART. So a fair degree of flexibility there. All of the IOs are grouped into little pieces, so about 6 pins a piece, and these can be mapped to either of the 2 IO processors. So you can pretty much create 2 separate I/O processing subsystems if you want. So there's quite a bit of flexibility in the device. There's also an 8-channel, 12-bit, 2 megasample per second ADC for analog sampling. And a number of the inputs can be used as interrupt signals to the I/O processors. And there are also PWM circuits for pulse width modulated outputs for controlling things like LEDs, intensities, and things like that. The 2, I want to go back. The 2 I/O, or the processors, are M4s that run, Cortex M4s, that run at up to 200 megahertz. Each one of them has its own local memory space. The application system. This is where the OS runs. It's a 500 megahertz ARM Cortex A7. It does have L1 caches for instruction and data, 256K L2 cache, and one of the big features that hitting this particular point technology allows us that fairly sizable memory, as I mentioned. There's a 4 megabyte system memory. On the chip, the OS can run almost completely memory resident. Pluton, the security subsystem. And this is where we spent the great deal of our focus. This is a 200 megahertz dedicated M4 that runs the security code. It uses a ROM for initialization and the initial boot. It's ROM because we wanted it to be immutable code. We wanted to know what it did and trust that that was the only thing that ran when it first started up. One of the main features of that ROM code is that it does a certificate validation of the security code that it will then subsequently load onto the M4 to run its security loop. So software won't even run if it hasn't been validated. The ARM M4 it runs all of its code local. It runs out of a tightly coupled memory that's 128K. That's all the more space that you need for that security block. There's also a 4 kilobit dedicated eFuse macro in here. This macro is where we store the cryptographic keys. They're stored in a fashion so that hardware can utilize them, but software can't read them. Another interesting feature of those keys, I'll cover that in the next block here. But also, in addition to the keys, we also score the security state. The chip is transitioned through a series of states as it goes from its initial manufacture until it's provisioned, and the keys are generated and stored in the device. And it also has rollback protection fuses. I mentioned that you have to guarantee that no older version of software can run that may have been compromised in some way. That's exactly what these rollback rollback state fuses are used for. It gives us a method of saying, do not run a version of software prior to this particular release. The Pluton engine inside this processing engine inside this core is IP that was developed by Microsoft. And it consists of most of the cryptographic elements themselves and the control features for these crypto keys and their respective fuse bits. It contains a random number generator, so that random numbers can be used in a number of the crypto operations. It's also used to generate its own initial private and public key pair. So these are hardware generated using a random number generated by the chip and then stored in eFuses. And I mentioned cannot be read by software. And that key pair is used for your asymmetric key operations and authenticating yourself with the service. It does have some standard cryptographic features, SHA engine, the AES, the Advanced Encryption Standard, as well as a public key accelerator, and this is used in the asymmetric crypto operations. In addition, there's a CCE, this complex command engine. What this does is it's basically a hardware sequencer for complex cryptographic operations that are multi-step. It allows the device, the hardware, the Pluton engine itself to present itself to the processor in a way that the processor can issue a single instruction and have a sequence of operations happen for it. Those are all hard-coded. They're not software programmable. So, what are all the things that we did to try to accomplish meeting those 7 properties? I'm not even sure this is the entire list. Like I said, keys are randomly generated. They're stored in fuses. They're not accessible to software. Crypto operations are performed in hardware. Doing crypto in software offers a lot of opportunity for those side channel leakage. There's still side channel opportunities in hardware, but we think we've learned quite a bit over the years and do a pretty good job of protecting that. The fact that we have the keys stored in a way that we don't know what they are, I can't read them from software, and we can restrict their use to specific operations, makes it less likely for hackers to be able to determine what those keys are from side channel attacks. Every one of the units within the device has a firewall at its interface to the buses. The reason this is important is we can isolate every device to its own memory region. One of the features a little further down there is the configuration bits that controls those are sticky. So the security code, when it starts up, can configure those firewalls and then lock them. Basically say these cannot be changed again without resetting the chip, preventing rogue software from being able to alter the chip's configuration. We have a series of watchdog timers. Every CPU has multiple watchdog timers, and these are arranged in a hierarchical fashion so that higher level processors within the system can make note of watchdog failures that are occurring at lower level, record those events, and report those events back to the cloud service. We use hardware-based attestation. What this means is that the software, when it's read in, is actually, we actually compute a hash and store that in a digest register, a register that cannot be reset by software. You can cryptographically exchange what that hash value is back with the service so that the service can say, tell me what version of software you're running, and by the way, prove it. And you have a mechanism of saying, here's the version that I'm running, and that's exchanged through a cryptographic operation, and proves back to the service that you're running the software that you claim you're running. There's no way to compute that hash and come up with the value accidentally and get it correct. So the application CPU I mentioned has an MMU. The reason for that is so that we actually have access to page tables. The operating system that runs on this device is actually based on a Linux kernel. So processes are run in their own pages. We use separate CPUs for many of the functions, as you see. There's 5 different CPU cores within the device, and they're all isolated to their own regions. Additionally, there's hardware error detection. All hardware errors that show up and interrupts that show up, these things get collected, and the OS collects that data and sends it back to the cloud for analysis so that we know whether or not people are tampering with the devices. And software is signed. All software comes with a certificate and signed by a trusted service, which gives the device a mechanism of knowing I can only run this software if that certificate matches the software that I've been given. Like I mentioned, there are no passwords. We use certificates instead. And we have the software rollback protection that's embedded inside the keys, or inside the fuses, rather. So that is it. Yeah. And I caught Alan off guard. I'm a little early.
Wow, I was called to my session chair duties more quickly than I expected. All right. Sorry, so we'll take questions. All right. Please give your name and affiliation.
Oliver Gonsekera from NG Codec. So great overview, very interesting. Any plans to open source the Pluto architecture to help the whole industry?
The operating system will be open source. The hardware, the Pluton security core, we are making available to chip manufacturers that have an interest in building secure devices. And the current plan is for that to be a royalty-free engagement. It won't necessarily be open source, but it will be available.
That's great, but I think to encourage academics and others, I would encourage you to do what NVIDIA did with their TensorRT, is actually put it on GitHub, the RTL code.
Jeff Smith, Citadel. Who owns the root key in a distributed product using one of these processors? Is it Microsoft? Is it the manufacturer or the retailer or the user?
Depends what you mean by root key. So for the operating system, it would be Microsoft.
If someone wants to push an update to some device I have in my house, like my refrigerator or my oven, who actually is a final authority on whether that gets pushed silently to the device or not?
For the operating system, it's Microsoft. For the application, it's The people who use the devices in their products, so the manufacturers, they actually have the ability to control that.
And there's no way for a user of a product to lock down or, say, I'm running some appliance, I have the final authority to restrict silent updates?
I don't believe that's in the plans today. Okay. I mean, short of disconnecting your device from your home Wi-Fi so that it's no longer connected.
Well, my last comment is that you're saying that we have to worry about malicious people like hacking someone's oven and so forth, but if I do recall from some Snowden slides, I think Microsoft might have been the first big company to roll over and turn over access to 3 other agencies. Well, in this case, it's for the certificates, right, that you're talking about. In terms of cryptographic operations, the only thing that's unique to the device is that private-public key pair. And we can't even extract that private key because it's generated by hardware, stored by hardware, and never available to software. So.
Okay.
And like I said, the OS is open source, so you can read what's out there.
Okay, next question is from the notorious Nathan.
Nathan Brookwood, Inside 64. Can you give us a sense of how you plan to provision these devices? Is there going to be an infrastructure that's going to be set up to do that, or how do you see that happening?
So that infrastructure exists today already. The provisioning, the assigning of the keys and certificates that are affiliated with those keys happens as a cooperative process between the IC manufacturer and Microsoft, and it's all handled as a cloud service. So we know every device that gets issued its security key, and we generate a matching certificate for each one of those devices as they're manufactured.
So that's linked to the chip itself?
Yes. So the certificate is based on that on its public key, and each public key is unique to the device.
And also, can you give us some sense of whether this would fit into any of the existing security frameworks that have evolved over the last couple of years, such as the ARM, PSA, or others like it?
I can't. I don't know the answer to that one. So.
Is that because you can't say, or because you haven't considered?
Because I don't know.
Okay. But
so my focus has been in the implementation of this device, and the services side of that is in another. It's in a parent org. So.
But there is an organization somewhere inside Microsoft that could answer a question like that?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay, that looks from here like the notorious John Wharton. Am I correct?
Yes, this is John Wharton, Applications Research. Going back decades, companies that introduce brand new microprocessor instruction sets, it's often a learning experience. The first generation often evolves into a second and third and fourth before it really seems to catch on. What kind of first off, I'm very impressed with the array of features and hardware modules and so forth. It's an impressive chip. But what kind of track record does Microsoft have in inventing new instruction sets, either as a corporation or the specific architects that were involved in putting this together?
Well, so we didn't introduce any architecture or any instruction sets here. The processors are all in existence. 4 of the 5 are made by ARM. The 5th one is an Andes N9. And the reason that one was selected is because our partnership with MediaTek, they already had an N9 implementation that ran all of their Wi-Fi code. So we left it as is.
I may have misunderstood. I thought there may have been extensions or adapters.
No, in this case, there were no extensions. So.
Thank you. Next.
Jeff Tuckey with NVIDIA. You mentioned you do a pretty good job with respect to side channel resistance. I'm wondering if you can disclose any specific hardware countermeasures against physical attack, side channel attacks, tampering with voltage, clocks, reset. And also, does any of that bubble up to the level of requirement in the Azure specification?
So today it does not bubble up. I'll answer that one first. I can't talk a lot about it, but the hardware, side channel resistance, because there's not much that I can really say about it. I will say though that we, like I said, we do restrict the use of keys, and one of the most, some of the most common side channel attacks are to be able to try to convince your crypto engines to do a massive number of crypto operations for you with random data. Since we restrict the use of those keys, and it's controlled pretty much by the hardware, they don't have that same opportunity. So
that makes sense.
Right.
On a related topic, how does the authentication interact with offline operation? For example, as a user, I might want to plug in my refrigerator while my internet is down, and I would expect it to work. So
the authentication is only going to be an issue when it's communicating data back and forth between the cloud, so that it knows who the device is and can confirm it, as well as ensuring that you've got a secure channel for communicating data and software updates. It's not required that it authenticate in that sense. The only thing that is required is that the software certificates are validated before the software is allowed to run. So offline operations should never be a problem.
Okay, thank you.
Welcome. You mentioned that your power supply unit is integrated, and so are these execution environments on different power domains, and how can they be shut off separately?
There are multiple power domains in the device. It's not completely by execution environments. It's more for particular power saving modes where there are portions of the design that can be shut down.
So when you power through a shutdown mode, does the image for that execution environment have to be re-signed or revalidated?
All of that revalidation occurs on a power cycle, but not as part of power down sequencing, only on a complete restart. So.
David Cantor again. So a lot of your infrastructure, as you mentioned, is built around IP from ARM and Andes. Are you agnostic with respect to those processors? Are you happy to look at RISC-V and other ISAs, for example?
So I hate to speak for the Azure Sphere OS development team. I don't know that I'm allowed to do that. However, I will say that all of the other peripheral processors that are in there, we're not completely committed to just ARM or Andes. Like I mentioned, the Andes in this case, it's dedicated for Wi-Fi processing, and we don't even touch that code. So yeah, I think we're fairly open to that. When it comes to the application processor, obviously, if we begin to support multiple architectures, it becomes more of a burden on the software team, and so I can't speak to what they're willing to do, but.
Sure. You're open, but you don't want to write the check that they have to cash.
Exactly.
Okay, I had one quick question. I don't know that you mentioned the power consumption.
I did not. This was never intended to be a battery-powered device, so we always assumed that it would be wall-powered in this first release, so we didn't focus a lot on power. We do have an extreme low-power mode where you pretty much shut down the entire chip other than a real-time clock, and the real-time clock is capable of waking the device back up. So in applications where you can shut it down for long periods of time, that works out pretty well. It's about 7 microwatts, so it's really, really low power on that section. The normal operating power with all of the CPUs running and the Wi-Fi fairly active can be as high as about 600 milliwatts. With the Wi-Fi shut down, it's about 200. Theoretically, if we ran all of the processors full bore and the radio full blast transmitting, we could get up over 2 watts, but you just wouldn't see that in a practical application.
Okay, good. Well, thank you very much.
All right, thank you.
Okay, our next next speaker and our last speaker today is going to be Scott Johnson, whose talk is going to be Titan, Google's root of trust security silicon. Scott's an ASIC designer, a design engineer at Google. He's been working for the last 4 years in the area of security silicon and was the chip architect and tech lead for the Titan program. His other co-authors on the presentation include Dom Rizzo, who's the Open Titan tech lead, Partha Ranganathan, who's the area tech lead for computer architecture, John McCoon, who's production security, and Richard Ho, implementation infrastructure. And I'll apologize for the program, which actually doesn't have Scott's name on it. It has Dom Rizzo. Scott?
Thank you. Thank you, Alan. I just saw your name in the Hot Chips 3 proceedings I saw in my garage yesterday when I was digging it out. It's great to see the conference going for such a long time. Thank you. So I'm here to talk today about Titan, which is Google's project to develop a silicon root of trust for the cloud infrastructure. It's a joint project between the Google security teams and the silicon teams within the company. I want to thank actually Doug also for setting up a lot of the information. I think a lot of the 7 principles he mentioned just before this are actually very relevant to our work. If there's 2 words I want you to take away from the presentation, the words trust and transparency are going throughout. I need to find my clicker. There we go. All right, so the outline for this presentation, I'm going to talk about the problem statement, the motivation for why we did the program. I'm going to talk about the system view and integration of the chip, how it's placed in the data center today. Dive into the architecture, since this is Hot Chips. Go into a few of the different features, do some deep dives into there, and talk about where we're going next in this program. So let's talk a little bit about the motivation for the project, which tells us that the architecture was formed. So you heard most of the sessions today probably by John Hennessy and others. Security is the key word for today. I probably don't need to go too deep into this. And if you had binoculars, you could probably read some of these headlines. These are the kind of headlines that our security guys, that keep them up at night. But the reality is they need to solve these before they become headlines, right? So they need to get ahead of these problems. And what we heard mostly today was about Spectre and Meltdown and things along those lines. But if you peel those away, there's a lot of other questions that we need to ask about security in the data center. So we could ask ourselves a few problems, for instance. How do we know it's our equipment that's in the data center? You think that's an obvious answer, but data centers are huge. They're distributed. They're all throughout the world. And so we want a way to know that it's our equipment that's actually in there and not being spoofed. So our solution is to tag and verify every device. We call this cryptographic attestation. So how can we trust the boot chains of our devices that are in the data center? Boot chains are a concern. Unauthenticated BIOSes and boot flashes are pretty easy ways to get into the data center and our vulnerabilities that we have to protect. Our solution is to make sure that all code that the system runs at reset time is signed and validated by something that's done in a vendor agnostic way. Being vendor agnostic gives us a chance to allow more types of devices into the system without restricting it to certain vendors. So in conclusion, we came to the reality that we need some sort of silicon root of trust, some way to tag and hold on to the notion that these devices are ours, and this root of trust needs to have some ability to control the firmware that the system is built upon. Our quote is, if we really want a chain of trust, we need to control the whole chain. And I don't think we're the only company that's come to this conclusion, as you've seen today. Some of the stuff that Microsoft has talked about and some of the stuff during the keynotes earlier has come to the similar conclusions. All right, so based upon these concerns, we came up with 4 properties. There's actually more, but I've listed 4 here on the slides today that we want to talk about as properties that we need to have in our cloud security. First one is we need to make sure that every element in the data center is securely identified. This is the earlier mentioned cryptographic attestation. Secondly, we want to make sure that the first instruction that's executed after boot by the system is understood, cryptographically signed, and verified, and monitored during its lifetime. Thirdly, we want to be able to monitor activities in the data center by super users and others that we think we trust, but we need to make sure that we have an ability to monitor and log any of the activities that go on. So if we do see problems later, we can go back and do a revision or a check as to what has happened and make sure that everything was done in the authenticated manner. Finally, we want an implementation that we can trust. So we really invested a lot into understanding every piece of the solution, from the silicon all the way up to the firmware on top of the silicon, as well as to the system firmware as well. So from these principles, we came up with some properties that the chip itself that will be our silicon root of trust must have. On-chip verified boot. If the silicon is the root of trust, the silicon itself must be ground zero for where we begin our trust monitoring. Cryptographic identity plus secure manufacturing. So secure manufacturing plays an important part in the identity. Once you've created the chip, you need to make sure that you can extend that identity and that trust throughout its lifetime. Boot firmware signature check. This is the firmware that lives outside the chip. As I mentioned before, we want to have some way to ensure that we are doing a signature check of the firmware itself and also monitoring that that EEPROM or flash chip is not being tampered with during its lifetime. We want the silicon itself to have a strong physical security defense. Even though this is in a data center, we need to have the ability to make sure that it's built on a strong foundation. And finally, the chip development needs to be as transparent as possible, developing as much of the IP and all the boot ROM and firmware on top of it as we can. Okay, so let's look in our situation at a system view of the chip and where it lives. So shown here is a sort of representative example of where the chip, shown in green, Titan, is living in somewhere between the CPU and the boot flash. In this case, it's shown communicating on SPI between the chipset in the form of like a PCH or a BMC and the boot flash itself. So in this sense, it's shown interposing on the SPI. This allows it to monitor all the activities of between the chipset and the flash. So at the beginning of time, the CPU will wake up and request its first boot instruction. This is what we call the first instruction integrity. All the code in this case needs to be signed on the boot firmware flash that's outside of our chip. Titan itself will make sure that it holds the chip, the rest of the system in reset while it does a firmware signature check of the boot code that's in the firmware in the flash. At that point, if all things look good, then it will release the power, or apply the power and release the reset for the rest of the system. After that time, it'll continue to monitor the firmware flash to make sure that there's no unauthorized activity. And it's also available as an oracle for cryptographic signing for any kind of logging that wants to be done. All right, so this is hot chips. Let's go a little bit into the chip itself. So in the end, what is this chip? It can be summarized as a secure, low-power microcontroller chip designed with these features in mind. It's also right here in my hand. It's kind of small. I almost lost it on the table. Our vice president Urs wore this as an earring in last year's Cloud Next conference. I don't know if anyone attended. Obviously, he's a vice president because he's much more dedicated. I didn't get my ears pierced. But Titan is not just the chip. It's also the system and the architecture that goes around it, as well as the manufacturing flow, which we'll get into in a little bit. And why did we feel the need to make our own? For one thing, we wanted to completely own as much as we could. As I mentioned, transparency is one of the words we were really interested in here. Understanding the implementation of the silicon gave us a beginning of the root of understanding of all the things that need to go into the data center. It also allowed us to audit much more of the code that's going on it if we control the whole chip. We wanted to build the local expertise to understand what goes into these devices. Secondly, the risks are changing all the time. You heard a lot of talks again about that today. If you have the ability to do in-field updates, you can have the agility that it's required to solve some of the problems that you see in the data center. And finally, for some of the features we were looking for, we just didn't really see the solutions we needed. For instance, the first instruction integrity, the SPI interposing, we just couldn't find a solution that could really work for us at that level. Okay, I'm not going to read this slide here, but I provided it for the future. This goes into some of the terms that you might find in a typical security silicon chip. and security acronyms that you'll find, things like RSA and elliptic curve. Leaving it here for your reference for the future if you need it. Okay, so let's look at the chip itself. So this is a pretty simplistic diagram, but it shows the design of the chip. On the left side here is an embedded 32 processor with its list of resident memories. All memories for execution are inside the chip, so we do not do any execution outside of the chip. The memories include a ROM, SRAM for scratchpad, 2 banks of flash, which are holding both instructions as well as data, and then fuses, which are very important for configuration control, as well as for keeping track of the device as it goes through its life cycle. In the middle here is listed a list of the cryptographic elements that we are using to offload the processor to do some of the more secure computations. The elliptic curve in RSA is like a big int accelerator unit. We have AES, SHA, and HMAC for encryption as well as hashing. We have a dedicated key manager unit, which is used to create the identity that we'll talk about in a few slides. And then the extremely important random number generator, which was a custom design that we made because the random number generator is so important for the device to be able to do not just random activities, but also create its identity in manufacturing. On the right-hand side is a suite of relatively pedestrian I/O that we use, low-speed USB, UART, SPI, which is extremely important and specially created for the interposing feature we mentioned, I2C, GPIO, et cetera. And finally, surrounding the rest of all of these and surrounding the whole chip is a suite of physical defenses that we use to help to make sure that the chip is not only guaranteed to be under control at reset time, but throughout the life of its execution all the way to power down. This includes a physical shield, temperature sensor, voltage detector, and a management of device state, and some alert hardware alert response mechanisms that we'll discuss in a moment. Okay, let's go a little bit into some of these different features that I mentioned at the beginning and how we put these chip features together to make them all work. So let's start with inside the chip. So as I mentioned, if the root of trust is your chip, then the very beginning of this root of trust, the ground zero as it were, is its own boot. All right, so this slide is kind of complicated. I'll take some time on this one. But this is basically showing a few principles. The principles are moving from the chain of trust from left to right, sort of in the way that your MC introduces the next speaker, who introduces the next speaker. You're handing off your chain of trust, right? You want to make sure that each stage checks the one that's to the next and validates that they're who you think they are and that they're in good shape. The earlier stages, shown the two middle in here, the boot ROM and the bootloader, are actually doing most of the sensitive control of the chip. They're doing the security settings and locking out the access as they move to the right. This is so that even though you've signed and control all of this code, you still want to reduce the attack surface so that the largest piece of code, the application, has the least amount of accessibility to the rest of the chip. So we do that by doing permission levels that are dropping as you move from one stage to the next. The next thing to note is that the two pieces of code that are in Flash actually have two versions and two different physical banks of Flash. We show them here as Flash A and B. This allows you to be executing in one bank while uploading a potential security update in the other Flash bank. And so you can, while you're running, make sure you've got a valid new piece of code that's coming in that you can validate. And then the code signing itself, again, all this code is created and signed by Google, by ourselves. It's an extremely serious process. It's a bunch of security guys in a room. It gets pretty complicated. But it's taken very seriously. It's actually a bunch of card key holders that can make sure that there's like a minimum quorum of card key holders that get together and do the signature check, the signature creation, and everything is logged and you follow a particular playbook that you trust. All right, so let's walk through these one by one. So in this case, the 4 layers that I've shown, the first layer is actually hardware itself. At reset time, the chip comes up and it uses built-in self-test in both a logic and memory form. So it does a logic BIST check as well as a memory BIST check. So this memory bits check is actually testing the boot ROM itself. So before you release reset for the rest of the chip, you have to ensure that the boot ROM is acceptable and has passed all checks. If not, then you stay in reset. So now the boot ROM is active, and if you remember silicon design, the boot ROM is actually locked down at tape-out time, right? So it has to be extremely small, or small enough so that you have 100% guarantee that there's no bugs in there, right? So it's immutable, and its job is to do some basic security setups and then hand off to the bootloader. And so again, there's two versions here. So the boot ROM is checking the two versions to see which one's the most recent, and then doing a signature check to make sure that everything is kosher, and if so, handing off. If for some reason that one fails, let's say you have uploaded a new version and your system dies in the middle of uploading, then you can always revert back to the previous one and try again. If they both fail, this should never happen. That's like awful particle or something, or maybe at the very beginning of manufacturing, then the chip is just frozen and you have to, basically there's no way out at that point. Okay, so moving on, the bootloader, it's setting up your basic security sets. Remember, the boot ROM itself is immutable, so you can't do a ton of stuff in there without being 100% sure at tape-out time. So we do some of the more sensitive settings of the security features in the bootloader. And then in a similar fashion, the bootloader, when it's complete, will be checking the version numbers of the two different applications in the two different banks and take the most recent one. If that one passes its signature check, then we're off. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about trusted identity. So this is the ability to make sure that the device is one that you can then use as an oracle of trust in your data center. So identity has to begin at manufacturing. This is the time when you control the device before it's shipped and installed into the data center. So each part is tested uniquely in a step we call personalization. And this step is one that gives the chip its own identity. It's given a unique but not secret serial number, which is basically a timestamp. And then it is loaded with personalization firmware that makes it use its random number generator to generate a cryptographically strong identity key. This identity is then registered in an off-site secure database that we have complete control of, so that the communication from one end, from the chip itself into the database, is all secured. The parts are then shipped, sent out into production fleet, and then they're available for the oracle of attestation. All the control and creation of the chip identity key is done by this key manager hardware. So the key to this is that the key manager hardware is controlling all the secret material. The processor never gets involved. Basically, the processor is walking through a sequence of opcodes that are very simplistic that just tell the key manager to create the identity. And so the pieces of the identity are coming from various silicon technologies within the chip. So that way, if for some reason an attacker wanted to subvert this activity, you would have to attack lots of different technologies within the chip: ROM, flash, fuse, gates, etc. All this state machine activity is done inside the key manager, and the final key is never really kept alive on the chip for any period of time, just long enough to export it during manufacturing. And that export step is then disabled after manufacturing is complete. So this shows a path of the device talking through the tester end to end to the registration, which is done remotely and through a secure channel. And this is all done using personalization firmware that's loaded in manufacturing. When the manufacturing step is complete, the personalization firmware is wiped and replaced with application firmware. Okay, so the identity can't stop at manufacturing. You need some way to track these devices to ensure that their integrity is intact throughout the life cycle of the device. So I've shown here what we call device lifecycle tracking, which is the ability to designate stages for the different periods of time that the part has in your hands or in the data center. So these 6 steps, or 6 stages, we call raw, where there's basically no features whatsoever. That's how it comes off the wafer. Test, where you have test features enabled only, no production features, and that's where you use it in manufacturing. We have two different stages that we can use for production, either development or production itself. I'll talk about that in a second. And then if for some reason we need to return the parts to be tested, then we have a special step called RMA for return for analysis, which basically turns the test ports back on. But once you're in RMA, then you can only go into the end of life stage. So this diagram shows how we use fuses to execute this. So on this picture, there's 6 stages shown in the 6 different columns. And I've shown 3 rows of fuses and how we could use them to encode the different states, just as an example. And so we're walking through time from left to right. So the beginning of time, as I mentioned before, raw state basically has no fuses blown, and the only thing you can do is blow a fuse. And that fuse is to get into manufacturing state. There's no other functionality. The test points don't work. There's no JTAG. There's no functionality of the processor. The only thing you can do is go into manufacturing test. That keeps you from, to some extent, from having wafers be stolen and then people start to use them. Manufacturing test enables the test boards, but there's still no production functionality at this point. And that's where I was showing earlier where the keys are generated. And then once you get past manufacturing, you can decide, is this part going to be used in the lab or is it going to be used in a production capacity? If it's in production, you go to the prod state, else you choose the dev state. And if you notice in the second bank there, they're mutually exclusive. So that allows you to designate if this part is for early development, in which case you may be doing some things that are opening up special features, but you don't want that to get into production. So that we make them mutually exclusive so that there's no chance that they would swap. Okay, so that should be the end of life for this device. This stays in production for the rest of its life. But if for some reason we have some problem that we need to bring it back for analysis, we give ourselves one step out, which is the RMA state. And then finally, once we're done with RMA, or if any time we want to complete if we want to get rid of the chip, basically we take it out of the fleet, we can go into the RIP state to basically effectively kill all of its functionality. Okay, stepping back again now to the system level, we'll talk briefly about the first instruction integrity. Again, this is the ability to trust the firmware that the system is booting off of, not the chip itself. So back showing this picture again, how Titan is interposing between the host and the flash. So again, it has 2 features, 2 functions that it needs to do here. First one is to make sure that the flash itself is signature checked at the beginning of time, and it holds the reset of the rest of the device. And also it needs to make sure that there's no unauthorized activity that's going onto the boot firmware. So in this picture here, we're basically snooping all activity bit by bit as it's coming in from the SPI to make sure that the request that's being asked for is authenticated. And so it may be someone's trying to do an illegal write to a flash bank or a piece of the firmware that we don't want it to write to. We were going to convert that to some harmless command, like say a read from a configuration register or something. Okay, I can see I'm running a little bit behind, so I'm going to just zip through this. I think that a lot of these are stuff that's been covered before, but we do have a series of physical countermeasures that we have on the chip. You may think it's not necessary for a data center part to really worry about physical security, but A, we want to research into these areas and understand them, and B, you really need to start from a strong foundation. You really need to consider all types of attacks. So we considered every one of these things to be in scope for our solution. Okay, he's giving me the okay to go a little longer. All right, so I've shown on the left there's a variety of physical defense detection that we're looking at here. So we've got voltage, glitch detector, light detector for like laser attacks. I'm not sure that'll happen in the data center, but we want to be super prepared. Temperature attacks, both high and low voltage temperature could cause problems to your device. We also have a lot of runtime integrity checks, make sure that the key manager is being used appropriately. The random number generator's output has got a nice clean entropy bit source. The clocks are not being tampered with. Actually, all clocks are generated internally, so there's no risk of external clock manipulation, but internal could still be done in lots of variety of ways. We have bus parity checks and bus obfuscation and things like that. So each of these could potentially indicate some sort of threat, what we call an alert. These alerts are basically interrupts that have a potential security special designation. And so they all go to this alert responder hardware, which is effectively an off-state piece of RTL that is controlling how do we respond to these alerts. So of course you would typically think, well, let's let the processor handle it, but we don't always trust that the processor hasn't been attacked itself. So there's an escalation path where the alert responder hardware can look to see if the alert is being handled by the processor, and if not, it can escalate. And the way it can escalate, it can either freeze the device to wipe all security state, or actually just reset the device altogether. Okay, so now we want to talk a little bit about where we're going to go with this program. I mentioned the two words that we wanted to consider at the beginning as trust and transparency. And you might have noticed, what is transparency good if it's transparent inside Google? So we really think that transparency is something that the rest of the industry should take a benefit of as well. So we feel all these features are good for the cloud industry as a whole. Open vendor agnostic solutions to improve security are a common good. We propose that the basic mechanisms of implementation for a device of this class are candidates for open source development. We see evidence of this, as we did earlier today, in things like open ISAs and collaborative open source communities. John, I think it was from Red Hat, who mentioned this notion that we can work on these problems together outside in the open. We know that open source doesn't solve all the problems, but it's a start. And so our outcome is that we want to create an open, transparent implementation of the Silicon Root of Trust. So what would this look like? This is just modeling the picture that I showed before as an example. But in this picture, what our goal is all these pieces we wish to be openly developed in the form of digital IP that's available. In the cases where there's the red dotted line, there's a lot of analog IP that's not going to be able to be open sourced as well, because that's going to lock you down to a vendor node. But at least we can provide a digital wrapper around that analog IP. And then, of course, you're going to have to take this to some vendor to get it built. So certain things like ROM, flash cells, fuse cells, those are not going to be that easy to open source. But again, we hope to put as much of a wrapper around it as we can. So to get to this conclusion, we needed some partners. And so at this point, we have already created a transparency working group called Silicon Transparency Working Group with some of our partners who are all experts in this area and have a lot of experience and a lot of manpower in this space. We'll be talking more about this at a later date as we continue to make progress. So that's all I had. It's 6:30. I think everyone's probably pretty hungry. And I'll take any questions unless you want a mad rush for the concessions. Thank you.
Yes. Yes, thank you. So we'll take questions. I would mention that most audience members and speakers love it when people finish early, but I've been warned that the people who serve the food are not so happy. So it's always good to end at just the right time. Okay, so go ahead.
Mr. Roper.
We can skip the questions if everybody would just want to go ahead. So, a bit of a controversial question, I guess. Earlier today, we talked about security, and Mark Hill talked about architecture 2.0 because our architecture is not secure. But from what you're describing here, it seems like if we wanted a secure architecture, you need to jump through like a ton of hoops. So maybe the right answer is just say, hey, our architectures are insecure, and if you want something secure, you need something like Titan?
Well, it's not a dangerous question. I think that's part of what we came to the conclusion is, it goes back to the attack surface. If you can reduce the attack surface to put the critical pieces into something like this, where you really spend a lot of time and investment into hardening the response, then I think you get at least you reduce the attack surface to something that you can trust at a higher level. Does that answer your question?
Do you think the main CPU still needs to be more secure?
Oh, yes, of course.
Can you provide all the security from a...
No, it's a distributed system, right? So you're never going to have all solutions solved in one place. So you need distributed security solutions as well. I think that just in this case, it sort of behooves us to invest more strongly in certain areas where we have the most critical amount of security in mind. So we don't handle payments, for instance, but obviously if you're getting into kind of money transactions, that's the kind of area where you really have to be extremely secure.
Okay, next question.
Yep.
Hi, Steve Heil from Microsoft. It looks like your implementation's on a NIC card kind of format, and I was just wondering if that's somehow cryptographically bound to the motherboard so that, you know, there's like a one-time key sharing.
So that image was of a card of that nature, but it could be applied to lots of different devices. We use it in a variety of different ways in the data center. And so once it's on the device, that's when you can use the identity to use it as like an oracle. So that kind of conveys the security principles to the whole card itself.
Okay, so presumably the chip could be just put down on the motherboard itself.
Yeah, that's right.
Thanks.
Yep.
Hi, Scott. I just want to know about how do you use temperature sensing as a defense mechanism? I mean, what are the components, temperature you monitor, and how often you monitor them?
There's no one answer. It kind of depends on the environment. So we have different places where the part is used. But typically, you could see, I mean, certainly we have to take some time to research the response of things like the random number generator in different environments. So let's say, for instance, which is not necessarily the case, but if you knew that there's a certain band of operation where the random number generator was guaranteed to be of high quality, then you would monitor to make sure you stayed within in the band. And of course, it would want to be something that's realistic for your data center environment in the first place, right? Obviously, if you're running it in a data center, you don't expect to be at negative 40 degrees, so probably means someone's doing some kind of nefarious activity if it's out of these bands of temperature.
Are you use IPMI like interface for temperature monitoring?
All of our solutions are created by ourselves, so it's not a particular. Maybe I missed the question.
So what's the prevalent technology used for temperature monitoring?
Oh, it's just a analog converter that's measuring. I don't know exactly all the details, but measuring the ambient temperature on the device itself.
Thank you.
John Demi, how is this different from Microsoft's Project Cerberus?
Surface or Azure?
Azure.
Azure. There's a few things that are different. I think the cost point is different, and the final application is limited. This is a much smaller power device. It's not intended to do a lot of the features that the Microsoft Azure is attempting to do. It's targeted for a certain number of applications. I didn't mention the specs, but it's 1/5 the size and maximum power of like 50 milliwatts. So it's a pretty low cost, low power device.
Okay.
Hi, I wanted to ask about the personalization during
Yep.
manufacturing.
Mhm.
It's pretty interesting. Do you rely purely on built-in self-test for the part of the security units that generate the key?
No, so that picture showing BIST was the step that happens every time you power the part in the data center. We actually use BIST, but also a long suite of manufacturing tests using ATPG and other types of components to guarantee the authenticity, the correctness of the chip before we get to the identity part.
So are you basically trusting the vendor to fuse the private key, or does the chip do that?
The chip does all that itself. It manages all the fusing, manages all the random number generation and everything. All this firmware is code that we've written that we install into manufacturing time.
Okay, so you just trust the vendor to test the part well enough to know that you can take it?
We write all the tests, so we own all that piece of it too. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
Interesting presentation.
Thank you.
Gabriel, Southern Intel. Seems like really interesting work. I was curious, since it seems very, I wouldn't say over-engineered, but very heavily engineered to especially tamper-resistant. What would you say the sort of next layer of vulnerability is? Specifically, I was wondering, are you worried about the fabs, being attacked there potentially not being correct? And then are you worried about other pieces in the system? Like, do you trust the CPUs or, the higher level picture of?
Yeah, so I think, at the end, it's always the software is the weakest link, right? So controlling and owning our software is the biggest hammer at this point. Spend enough time with these security guys and you can just go nuts with paranoia. Like you can go down to the bottom turtle of the stack, right? Or keep going. I think at some point you've got to trust that someone like TSMC cares about their reputation. So if they insert a Trojan horse into their implementation after your GDS2, then that's probably about the line where we stop worrying too much about it.
Thank you.
Okay, I think 2 short questions and then we're out of time.
Sure. Hi, this is Srinu from Xilinx. There is a block called timers in your block diagram, so can you explain what those timers do?
The timers?
Yeah.
So we actually, I didn't mention this, but we actually have 3 clocks in the chip. One is a variable frequency chip clock, which is used to make sure that the implementation of the execution of all the crypto is different every time you run it. So we call that like a jittery clock that's like a spread spectrum clock. And then we have a timer clock, which is important when we're talking to the outside world for things like UART and USB, where you have to have a fixed amount of time. And so the timers are attached to that clock. And that can be used for, just general runtime operating system type of features.
Okay, last question.
Curtis Bowman with Dell.
I'm
wondering, that work group you were talking about, is that something you're going to open publicly?
It will be open. It's not at the moment opened yet. We're going to do a little bit more preparation for it to ensure that we've got it in good standing before we go to the next step of announcement. We just kind of put this out there because we think it's the right way that the industry should be going. And we've gotten that start with them so far. And it feels like that at the appropriate time, we will present what we've got as sort of a representation of how we want to go forward with this. And at that time, we'll have more information. We'll also kind of open the doors a little bit to how we're developing it.
Do you have a time frame, rough time frame, end of year, next year?
Not yet sure, but probably next year-ish.
Thanks.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.